Hello, I'm Josephine Mead, the Communication and Program Coordinator at Artis Worldwide Network of Arts Residencies. We're an arts residency network with 650 members in over 80 countries, and we work to ensure that the global arts residency field remains professional, diverse, inclusive, and sustainable. And today I'm joined with Eduardo Cassina, who is an urban and regional planner and residency organizer. Eduardo has a background in architecture and urban sociology. From 2014 to 2020, Eduardo co-directed an urbanism practice, Metasitu, based in Kiev, working with different actors in post-industrial shrinking cities in Ukraine. Eduardo is currently a PhD research fellow at the University of Agder in Norway. He's looking at how artist residencies hosting socially engaged practitioners can be integrated into planning processes, expanding the scope of participatory planning and making it a more inclusive and rooted field. Thank you so much for joining me today, Eduardo.
Thank you so much, Josephine, for this opportunity. I'm really excited.
Good, well, take it away.
Um, um, sorry. Right. So, yeah, thank you very much. As Josephine said, I am an urban planner and a residency organizer and a gong player. Today we will talk about these two, about how I integrate artist residencies in urban planning processes. And I guess before I show how these two fields coalesce together in my practice, I wanted to talk a bit about how I got there through organizing artistic workshops in planning contexts. So, as Josephine said, between 2014 to 2020, I was living in Ukraine. Ukraine, like many countries, has a very large number of post-industrial shrinking cities, declining cities that used to be mostly built around one particular industry. Other examples that maybe are I like resonate a lot with us are things like Detroit or the Ruhr region in Germany, or maybe other regional centers in places like Japan. As an urban planner, I had been taught that um, a model of growth where there is a tabula rasa and you just kind of like accumulate land by taming it or or building upon it. And in many ways, it's almost as if there was a very clear route to follow, where you inject concrete foundations into the ground and build more. And yeah, this is how my educational background came about. But this was very far from the reality that I saw on the ground with my collective Meta Situ when we were working there. In fact, we encountered a lot of cities that had been shrinking really, really rapidly, and where rewilding processes had already began. And I guess that this context led us to establish our first kind of artistic initiative, which was the Degrowth Institute, which consisted on a series of immersive workshops to think alongside residents of rapidly shrinking areas about non-growth urban futures. We called it the Degrowth Institute, and we were in fact registered as an organization because by becoming an organization, by institutionalizing our practice, um, we had more access to funding and to certain spaces. But the initiative remained extremely grassroots. We were collaborating with different local organizations that were present and operating from the degrowth or the shrinking cities that we were working with. And we were mostly working in eastern Ukraine, which also includes an area called the Donbass region, which is famous for mining. Here you can see us on top of one of those mining heaps, together with a local NGO that we partnered with in Dobropilia. At the time when we established the Degrowth Institute in 2015, a lot of the degrowth literature we encountered was very much based on the West. So where degrowth was almost seen as a choice, was almost seen as something to evolve into after like extremely wealthy societies. But this was very, very different from what we were seeing, because I guess in these cities, uh, degrowth was not so much a choice, but the result of macroeconomic trends, the dissolution of imperial regimes, the collapse of industries, and boom and bust urbanism. So, what does degrowth mean in this context, and how can we start thinking of degrowth in this context? Um, we are still, I mean, since 2015, we're still navigating what we mean by degrowth. We really think it's a bit of a fluid definition, um, and it's definitely not about um, demolition or necessarily stopping construction, but rather any form of development that does not have growth at its core, that doesn't have, that operates in just any other, like other vectors, that sees the future alongside other imaginaries. Tapping into this kind of discourse allowed us to explore an understanding of the city that kind of became a bit more expansive. So, for example, in these post-mining regions, we were thinking of these soil heaps, which is basically the raw earth that comes out from the mines and is like piled up as they were taking coal out of the ground. In the workshops and the conversations we had with locals, we noticed that the soil heaps, although they were making or they had a significant footprint on the city, both on an aerial level, but also in terms of the skyline, because there would be like these big mountains on otherwise quite flat landscapes, um, remain somehow kind of away of the everyday lives of people. Um, Spaces that were intimidating, spaces that were kind of no-go zones, and ultimately capitalogenic spaces that had been created by humans um, in mining processes, um, spaces of waste, but also maybe spaces of possibility, um, and setting new forms of eternity, because they were there to alter landscape for timelines that superseded humans. So this kind of like background was the framework that we used to approach the Degrowth Institute, and we developed a self-guided or self-organized workshop manual that was called the Degrowth Manual. The Degrowth Manual was designed in black and white, freely available online. Anyone can download it, and very cheap to print. That's why we made it black and white, A4. And we designed it in a way that it could either be, one could go through the exercises by them, like alone, or collectively as a group. We called it a firecracker publication because the goal of this publication was to ignite conversations. And in many ways, people could go through and just fill out the different exercises. There were some texts and some prompts for reflection. It was also a manual that with every workshop we organized was slightly changed and modified. So there was like a feedback loop that kind of like altered its shape. It was designed bilingual in Russian and English, and we started deploying it, as I said, working with local organizations in different cities mostly across Eastern Ukraine, but we also did it in other places like Germany, where we would pay participants and had local stakeholders hired as experts. So basically, for 2 to 3 days, which is how long the workshop lasted, we would work with these people, kind of like with their insights as to of their town and how their town was shrinking or growing. Sorry, like the stories of their city and going through the exercise. It was for us important to have this kind of eye-to-eye collaboration with participants so that we would not engage in yet another extractive practice, another boom and bust urbanism at a smaller scale. Um, Through the manual, we were collecting their impressions of the ebbing towns and having conversations. And it was a conversation, starting conversations around uncertainty through different exercises. One of the exercises in the manual, for example, was the degrowth tarot. So it was a set of custom-made tarot cards um, that participants could cut out of the notebook um, and basically through a game start thinking or of degrowth futures for their town. This was an instrument, a tool, which I started calling a prosthesis, as I will later further describe. But it allowed us to have conversations that were perhaps not so easy to have initially. So the degrowth manual was a very, very immersive, and it allowed us to work together in close proximity for several days as a group. And at the end of the workshops, participants will give us their filled out notebooks, and we will give them a blank notebook. The idea is that they could have another workshop with other people, or they could just keep it as a souvenir. And the filled out notebooks would be part of the Degrowth Institute's archive. So the Degrowth archive, which I will talk a bit more later. With these exercises, we wanted to start thinking collectively of futures that weren't just about relentless expansionism. How do you translate? But the question remains, like, how do you translate these ideas into the master's tools? How do you trigger these notions into planning change? How can those initiatives and ideas make it to the planner's table? So there were several ways where we could do that. Often we would have planners and municipal workers being part of these workshops, and sometimes the translation of these ideas was perhaps uh, a bit a bit more challenging. Um, of course, it is important to mention the current situation of war and genocide that is happening in Ukraine. The Degrowth Institute stopped all its workshops permanently in the wake of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by the Russian army. It makes really no sense to talk about degrowth in the context of mass destruction, particularly because a lot of those shrinking cities that we were working with were in eastern Ukraine, which is one of the regions most affected by this current conflict. Um, However, we are now thinking on how to repurpose the Degrowth Archive, which is right now in Kyiv and contains all of these memories and incredible soft data of communities that have been ravaged, like destroyed. So how can we repurpose that information that we collected in a totally different context for the reconstruction of Ukraine is kind of like a conversation that we have ongoing. As artists, of course, we were circulating, our work was circulating in, I would say, more traditional circles like museums and galleries. But I always felt that the Degrowth Institute was difficult to translate into an exhibition format because the real work was not so much the information collected or works that we as artists could translate from those encounters into here, but rather how people gathered together, we were able to bring together, and the tools we created in those processes. So these tools is what I'm calling now the planning processes. I call them planning processes because they allow us for new ways of sensing a planning, a matter that is under planning consideration. So a landscape or a built environment. So these are tools that current planning processes do not have, but with them, we are able to obtain new relational insights. I think it is important to say that, or the way I position planning processes is that they distance themselves from the notion of the cyborg, the body that through technology seeks enhancement and productivity, which I think finds its urban equivalent in the e-city and the control room, that gathers data through data points, but rather moves towards what Francesca Spector and Sarah Fox's definition of the cribborg, which is a body that is adopted to foster mutual aid, joy and fulfillment, DIY and low tech. Like, for example, this project I was not part of, but it was a group of research architecture students at the University of Goldsmiths that were working with a community in Alaska, making models and tools to help them build a claim against oil companies for rising seawater levels. But I think this experience of um, uh, working together in groups kind of like opened up these doors in terms of like thinking of residencies as practice. As an artist, I had, of course, participated in a lot of residencies, but I thought that maybe there was a way to further explore this format um, in which through which different realities coalesce together, um, particularly when they're working towards one kind of common theme or addressing one kind of common issue. So we started organizing residencies. Like, for example, this is a residency we organized in Western Ukraine, where there was a large factory complex that was about to be kind of like turned into a creative hub. And the organizers of this residency were a local NGO, cultural NGO, that invited us to kind of like, through artistic workshops, mediate the different groups of like former workers, nearby residents, newcomers, kind of like establish dialogue and build different relationships and works together. Um, as a group, we were not only working with residencies with artists, but actually thinking, also working with just practitioners like anyone, thinking of ways to work together. This is a project that is called Foundation, where through an anonymous open call, for 1 week, we invited 6 strangers to live together, and they were being filmed. They were not living, they were kind of living in isolation in a gallery space in Germany. And together we were building a new community, the foundations for a new community through artistic practice. So of course there was a lot of like kind of like hardware and like building the spaces that we inhabited, but also kind of like building a lot of rituals around uh, us coming together and being together. So this kind of like very long introduction, it's basically the what led me to talk about today, which is like 3 projects that I will kind of brush through that I developed in the city of Slavutych, 2 of them with my collective Metasitu, and the third one together with another group of people. So Slavutych is a city in northern Ukraine. Slavutych was built in 1988 in the wake of the Chernobyl, explosion of the fourth reactor on the 26th of April of 1986. So right after that reactor exploded, they needed to evacuate Pripyat, which was the town that was built next to Chernobyl nuclear power station, nuclear power plant, to rehouse the workers, because Chernobyl nuclear power plant continued working as a nuclear power plant until the year 2000. So in order to build that space, they needed to figure where to accommodate them. So this is a map of the exclusion zone, which is an area that exists today in Ukraine and parts of Belarus, where people basically are not allowed to move into or to live now, because it's considered one of the most toxic places on Earth as an aftermath of that accident. And when I was looking for this map, I actually the better map I could find was actually this one, which is actually revealing how the Russian troops in the early 2022, at the beginning of the war, kind of like also took over this exclusion zone, this heavily toxic space, which again maybe brings in another layer of like the weaponization of this toxic landscape. Um, uh, and also, it's interesting to think about this in relation to another nuclear power plant that is currently under Russian occupation further down the river, Energodar, also known as the Zaporizhia nuclear power station, and the constant threats that are happening in terms of like how that space is being weaponized, and the threat of potential ecocide. Um, but anyways, back to 1986. So as you can see, Chernobyl and Pripyat are there. And then if you look, I don't know if you can see right now, it's covered on my screen is covered by the things. But anyways, Slavutych is here in the top right corner. And they just built a train line that connected both areas. So Slavutych is outside the exclusion zone, is not an area that was polluted or heavily affected. I mean, it was affected, but the pollution didn't stay on after the nuclear fallout. So this was the construction. As I said, the construction of a city took place really fast between 1987 and 1988. And in order to be built, it was constructed. They had a Ukrainian team master plan the city, and then each of the different neighborhoods or districts, here they call them quarters, were designed by a different Soviet republic. And the Soviet Republic would bring everything from design to construction, like their own workers, materials, knowledge, designs, engineers, architects. Everyone was coming from these different countries. And then kind of like they would each build their own town, their own neighborhood, and the neighborhood would be then called after the capital city of the Soviet Republic where they came from. So this affected both the hardware. For example, this is the Yerevan district, and those of you who've been to Armenia can recognize the pink tufa stone that is very characteristic of Yerevan, but also the software. Like, for example, this is Old Tallinn, which is like a Estonian restaurant in the Estonian district that still exists today. And there are also some hints at Soviet postmodernism, which as an architect, I think is kind of quirky and fun. So one of the first projects we did there was called 14th District, where we got funding to bring EU and Ukrainian exchange collaborations. And we wanted to create a space to reflect on the unique urban history of Slavutych. So we organized a residency, which was an open call for people from Slavutych. We selected 5 people, completely intergenerational. None of them was an artist, to work together for several months in Slavutych and then come to Athens to look at the city. And then based on that, they would design a new 14th district for their city back home. So we took a totally transcalar approach in terms of like how we were looking at the city. This is kind of like the document we produced afterwards in 4 languages: Ukrainian, Greek, English, and Russian. And we were looking at commonalities, like, for example, how both cities were built around a ruin. In the case of Slavutych, it was the ruin of the fourth reactor. In the case of Athens, was the Acropolis. The scale of the city, typical buildings and building typologies, but also things like particles, like sound. We eventually had an exhibition in Athens and then one in Slavutych. Uh, their understanding for the district, which was a plot of land that the mayor allowed us or gave us to use for the project. Of course, we were not going to build a district with residential facilities, but what would that district be? They decided to create an archaeological park for the future of Slavutych, because it was a very new city from 1988, and kind of like planting seeds for people to discover in the future. And then we also made a film um, reflecting on this experience. The year after, we came back to Slavutych, but this time as the directors of the urbanism program at 86 Festival. So as directors, we had 3 main kind of like targets. The first one, or programs, the first one was to create a series of architectural workshops that lasted 2 weeks. So we would have architects coming from all over Europe, where for 2 weeks they would build a series of pavilions and infrastructure that would then be used for the festival for people to stay at or whatever, and then also was being unbuilt right after the festival, because of course it's not a matter of like just leaving the town littered with pavilions. And then we also had an artist residency where for 1 month we invited 9 international and Ukrainian practitioners with socially engaged practices. So, for example, this is the installation by resident Mikaela Lakova, or the performance by Olesa Onienko and Katya Berlova, who kind of went into the sewage, an abandoned sewer in the city, and they organized a rave, and then people could like look from above. Um, or, for example, the Swiss photographer Sibylle Feucht. And I want to stop here and talk a bit more about Sibylle, because this is quite an interesting story. So in her work, she was kind of photographing interiors, Slavutych home interiors. But Sibylle also had a project space in Bonn, in Germany, where she lives. Sibylle had never been to Eastern Europe, let alone Ukraine, before this residency, and she was just there for a month. But of course, that month in residency led her to other projects in Ukraine, and she developed friendships and working relationships that kind of like got her going more in Ukraine. And in the wake of the full-scale war, she turned the programming of her project space completely into promoting Ukrainian culture. So she paired up with a Ukrainian film person, Nadia Parfan, and they developed like an entire film program. And she even kind of like invited former resident Olesa Onienko, the one with the rave, who is a DJ. She invited her to come and perform, as well as many other Ukrainian um, artists. So I think of this a bit of as a deferred value, because clearly when I was filling out the report for the funding bodies from this residency back in 2018, I think it was, um, there is no way I could have like foreseen that this type of solidarity would emerge from an event like this. Um, a third project that I developed in Ukraine was got me thinking also in terms of like how the narrative of Slavutych had to change. So this is basically what they call the sarcophag in Ukrainian Russian. It basically is like a big dome over the fourth reactor to avoid radiation from kind of like leaving. And this kind of structure, which is only built for the next 100 years until they find another solution, was wheeled in 2017. It took 17 years to build, and it was a compendium of 4 organizations, and I believe led by a French engineering office. But this, in many ways, had become like the icon of Slavutych or Chernobyl. Like people were coming to Slavutych to go see that, take the train to Chernobyl and see that. But I felt that this was a missed opportunity because actually the history of Slavutych is way more important than whatever happened in Chernobyl, because of its unique architectural history. Eugenia Gubkina, an architect, um, had or wrote an architectural guide about the incredible legacy or modernist legacy that this beautiful, beautiful town of Slavutych has. But it was just kind of like one book, and somehow Slavutych, even I, before I went to Ukraine, I had never heard of this town, and I was thinking, how can we place Slavutych maybe in a cognitive map um, for practitioners elsewhere? So I approached the European Association, a European Assembly for Students of Architecture, Ukraine committee, um, and I proposed that maybe we should organize an event or a residency in Slavutych because of its unique history, and this would allow us to bring like a lot of architecture students as well as young practitioners to Slavutych for a small residency for a small period of time. Because I had been working in Slavutych before, I was able to talk with the mayor, and we were granted access to the hospital. So Yuri Fomichaev, the mayor at the time of Slavutych, gave us access to this former polyclinic hospital, which was 10,000 square meters, and it had been abandoned, I think, since 2003 or 2000. Yeah, it had been abandoned for a long time. Um, and basically, we brought together all these, as I said, architectural students and spatial practitioners from all over Europe to kind of involve them in the history, in the incredible urban and architectural history of Slavutych. Because it was COVID, it caught us in the middle of COVID. We had to like adapt and break up the groups and do things like sleep outside. But the idea was that people could come to this abandoned hospital and then turn it into installations, and that every room would have like different works of art, and that with the years it would be adding. Unfortunately, this was the only addition we could do because the summer after, Slavutych was actually under Russian occupation. Luckily, is now again under Ukrainian control. Um, and yeah, that just kind of like this to wrap up, like kind of like reflecting or thinking about how the war kind of like inserts itself, and the importance of artist residencies, I think, is also exemplified in this other great example, which is MetaLab. MetaLab is an organization in Western Ukraine. I've collaborated with them multiple times in the past, and most of the things they did before the war was organizing artist residencies. They were established in 2017, and the residencies often looked at addressing immediate issues such as locally produced knowledge or the gentrification of the industrial complex. That was the residency I was talking about earlier, or if issues like upcycling. So in the wake of the full-scale invasion, MetaLab turned to converting disused buildings into temporary homes for IDPs, internally displaced peoples, mostly from Eastern Ukraine. And so far, they have housed in Western Ukraine, which is the safer part of the country, around 1,500 people in 7 buildings that they have reconverted or readapted. In the words of one of its founders, Anna Pashinska, the war showed how important these ecosystems that they had been building were. Quote, the building we had, the knowledge we had developed during the residencies on upcycling or mutual aid, which a lot of people, including my parents, did not understand, suddenly became very useful as supply chains were interrupted. Former international residents mobilized and helped in their effort through their source of materials or supported the evacuation of people into the EU or through direct donations. MetaLab had knowledge about who in the local community had what skills and was able to fulfill what role, a grassroots knowledge that the local authorities did not have, and the city council had to come to us to meet these new needs. End quote. So again, this is another example, a bit like Sibylla's example before, of deferred value that at the time of the residencies were taking place before the war, before the threat of Russian invasion, it was maybe not tangible or as tangible as it then proved to be. Uh, of course, like we don't necessarily need a war to show how important these ecosystems that residences create are, but I think these are just very good examples. And this is kind of leading to the last thing I will talk about today, which is my current project, my current PhD project, which is an action research project set in Kviefjord or Gjertavodna, which is a community in Sápmi in northern Norway. It's basically 27 pavilions that used to make northern Norway's largest residential mental facility. And in 91, with a law reform, basically the facility was shut, but there was not necessarily a plan for its afterlife. And it used to be northern Norway's largest. It's mostly a series of modernist buildings scattered along a fjord that were designed by Else Torp Larsen. And although the idea of a residential facility for neurodivergent people right now maybe invokes a lot of scary thoughts, this place definitely created a lot of emotional ties, even within people from that particular community. They created a lot of DIY prostheses themselves that would suit their needs. And they even created their own bunad, which is this kind of like national costume of Norway that is topo specific, so specific to each little village. And they kind of created this outfit to be like, oh, we are part of this national narrative. At the same time, they're also part of Sapmi, indigenous land. And it's also interesting how this comes through. This is where it's located. This comes through in a lot of the things they did. And also the notion of artist residency. So Trastad Gord, the residential facility, pioneered art therapy or art education, particularly through the work of Sigvard Riksheim, who was later recognized for her incredible work doing artist residencies, artwork, art therapy. And that set the basis for today's the National Collection for Outsider Art. But of the many artists that are collected, I want to show the work of just two works of Johan Hansen, who was one of the residents at Trastad Gård, and he came in as a child and he stayed there until it closed in 91. And he was Sami, and he was producing works like, for example, these elks with clear Sami themes, at a time when contemporary Sami artists outside of the residential facility were not necessarily able to create works reflecting on their Sami identity just because of the assimilationist policies that existed at the time in Norway. The venue, two of the pavilions are right now a welcome center for refugees, but a lot of them are just storage facilities and in disused. So I hope that with this residency, we kind of can reflect on not only the built landscape and the legacy of Trastad, but also where it's situated in the landscape. It's situated at a crossroads of transhumance or kind of like historic trails for the movement of sheep and reindeer. Also, how it sits with like more than human ideas and ecologies, and thinking about this matters and how by bringing artists together that would kind of address these issues and think and try to unveil like the relational insights on how these pavilions sit within that community, hopefully provide new tools or new understandings of how to move forward or what to do with this incredible legacy. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Eduardo. That was wonderful. It 3 different projects that really show how powerfully transformative arts residencies can be.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.